In the small, picturesque town of Selmer, Tennessee, there lived a couple that everyone envied. Matthew Winkler, the well-respected preacher at the local Church of Christ, was the epitome of goodness in the eyes of his congregation. His every word was filled with wisdom, his every action with kindness. His wife, Mary, stood by his side, always the perfect reflection of grace and devotion, adored by all who knew her. Together they seemed to have everything: 3 young daughters, a home filled with laughter, and a life built on faith and community. On the surface, nothing appeared out of place. But behind the closed doors of their home, the facade was beginning to crack. Mary, though admired by all, felt a growing emptiness inside. The constant demands of being the preacher's wife, always smiling, always maintaining a perfect image, left her drained. She had sacrificed so much for her family, yet she felt invisible. Matthew, lost in his devotion to the church, had become distant, consumed by his role as a leader, leaving little time for her or their children. In the quiet of their home, Mary would often sit alone, watching the flicker of candlelight cast shadows on the walls. The silence between her and Matthew grew louder, more unbearable. She longed for connection, for someone to notice her beyond the role she had been assigned. But Matthew was always busy, always preoccupied with his ministry. In his eyes, she was everything: his partner, the mother of their children, the picture of perfection. But to Mary, it felt more like a prison than a partnership. Her heart ached with the weight of unspoken words, of unmet needs. The affection and warmth she craved seemed out of reach. There was a growing sense of being lost, a yearning for something that she couldn't name. And so, like many women in silent desperation, she began to look elsewhere for comfort. Her first interaction with Terry, a local bank employee, seemed harmless enough. A brief conversation in passing at the grocery store, a polite exchange of pleasantries. But to Mary, it felt like a lifeline thrown into the abyss. He was different from Matthew, attentive, present, and genuinely interested in her as a person. At first, their conversations were casual, but as the days passed, they grew longer, more intimate. Terry listened in a way that Matthew had not in years. He made her feel seen, but Mary knew she was treading dangerous waters. Her internal conflict grew with each passing day. She loved Matthew. There was no doubt about that. He was the father of her children, the man she had once dreamed of a life with. Yet something had shifted between them. The spark that once ignited their love was now just a flicker, barely visible. In the evenings, when Matthew was busy with church affairs, Mary found herself spending more and more time with Terry. Their conversations deepened, and the connection between them intensified. Mary didn't know what she was doing, but it felt good to be wanted, to be noticed. It was a comfort she hadn't felt in a long time, and soon it became more than just a friendship. But the guilt gnawed at her. Every time she laughed with Terry, every time he touched her arm or complimented her, she felt like she was betraying the very life she had built with Matthew. Her heart raced with shame, but she couldn't stop. There was a sense of powerlessness, as if she was drowning in her own emotions, unable to swim back to the surface. Meanwhile, Matthew remained oblivious, consumed by his ministry. He had no idea that his wife was slipping away from him, that she had found solace in another man's presence. In his eyes, everything was perfect. The church was thriving, his family was intact, and Mary seemed to be the picture of a devoted wife. But as the days passed, something began to shift. The calm, controlled exterior of their life started to show signs of unraveling. Matthew noticed the subtle changes in Mary, her late nights, her increasing distance. He didn't know what to make of it. Mary's emotional affair with Terry became more than just a diversion. It was a symptom of something deeper, the crumbling foundation of a marriage that had once seemed unshakable. And as the tension between Mary and Matthew grew, so did the danger of what she was doing. But for now, the illusion of perfection held, and the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface remained unseen by all but Mary. As the days passed, the growing distance between Mary and Matthew seemed to stretch further than ever. Mary found herself sinking deeper into the void of her loneliness. The silence that had once been a comfort now felt suffocating. She couldn't remember the last time Matthew truly saw her, the last time they laughed together or shared a quiet moment. Instead, she spent her days filled with a hollow routine, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness inside. Then, Terry entered her life. It started innocently enough, just brief, casual conversations at the local grocery store, but there was something about him that made Mary feel seen. Terry was attentive, patient, and easy to talk to. Unlike Matthew, he wasn't distracted by the demands of his job, his ministry. He listened. He made her feel like she mattered, something that had been missing for so long. The first time Terry casually touched her arm while laughing, Mary felt a jolt of warmth spread through her. It was a simple gesture, but to her it felt like an oasis in the desert. She told herself it was nothing, just friendly banter. But her heart fluttered every time their hands brushed, every time their eyes met across the room. Mary found herself thinking about Terry constantly. Their conversations became longer, more intimate. She started to look forward to seeing him. A small part of her felt guilty, but she quickly brushed the feeling aside. She had tried to talk to Matthew, to ask for his attention, but he was always too consumed by his work. Terry was a distraction, yes, but one she couldn't seem to resist. One evening, after a particularly long day at church where Matthew had barely acknowledged her presence, Mary found herself standing in front of the bank. She had just finished some errands and wasn't in any particular rush to head home. She was waiting for something. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was her own loneliness pushing her forward. Either way, as soon as she saw Terry walking out of the building, her heart skipped a beat. "Mary," Terry greeted her warmly, his smile genuine and comforting. "I was hoping to see you today." Mary's stomach fluttered nervously. She wasn't used to this, someone noticing her in such a way. "I just had a few errands to run," she replied, her voice softer than usual. Terry's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he spoke again. "You're always so busy with everything. It's good to take a break sometimes." And in that moment, Mary felt something stir inside her, something that had been dormant for far too long. The loneliness, the neglect, the years of silence in her marriage. Terry made it all feel like a distant memory. She didn't have to be perfect around him. She didn't have to pretend. The next few weeks unfolded in a blur. Mary began finding reasons to visit Terry at the bank. She wasn't lying to Matthew about her whereabouts, but there was a sense of secrecy about the visits, something she couldn't quite explain. With Terry, she felt alive again. He made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years, and his attentiveness made her feel like the most important person in the world. One evening, after a few casual meetings, Terry suggested they grab coffee together. Mary hesitated. She knew that what she was doing wasn't exactly right, but she also knew that it felt good. In a way, it was the most alive she had felt in a long time. She agreed. They sat together at a small cafe, their conversation flowing easily. Mary found herself confiding in him about her struggles with Matthew. She talked about the emotional distance that had built between them, the lack of affection, the loneliness. Terry listened intently, offering kind words and support. "I wish I could just get him to notice me," Mary said quietly, looking down at her hands. Terry reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was reassuring, and for the first time in a long time, Mary felt like someone truly understood her. "You deserve more than this, Mary," Terry said softly. "You deserve to feel loved and appreciated." In that moment, something shifted inside her. She didn't know what it was, guilt, fear, or a yearning for connection, but the lines between right and wrong started to blur. It wasn't just an emotional connection anymore, it was something deeper. The next time they met, the tension was palpable. As they walked down the quiet street, Terry reached for her hand again, and this time, Mary didn't pull away. They walked in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared secret pressing down on them. Finally, Terry turned to her, his voice soft yet deliberate. "Mary, I think about you. All the time," he confessed, his eyes searching hers. Mary felt her heart race. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a connection that felt impossible to ignore. "Me too," she whispered. As they parted that evening, their hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, a silent promise passing between them. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. Mary didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally seen. Matthew sat at his desk, the stack of bills and paperwork before him a constant reminder of everything that had been slipping through his fingers. The house was quiet, too quiet. Mary was out again, something she had been doing more and more often. His suspicions had grown louder over time, like an echo in the back of his mind that he couldn't escape. And tonight, something felt different. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence between them almost suffocating. His eyes flicked to her purse on the table, a casual glance at something he had long ignored. It had been weeks since he first suspected that something was off. At first it had been small things, the late nights, the quick glances she exchanged with Terry when they spoke in passing. He had brushed it off as paranoia, but now it was too glaring to ignore. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he reached for her purse. He hesitated. He hadn't planned on doing this, but tonight, the need to know the truth overcame him. He pulled the purse open and his fingers brushed against the cool leather of her wallet. There it was, a small folded piece of paper. It was a receipt for a hotel room, dated just a few days ago. His breath caught in his throat. Matthew unfolded it, his hands trembling. His eyes scanned the receipt, and his worst fears were confirmed. The name on the receipt wasn't his. It was Terry's. His blood ran cold as the realization hit him. His wife, the woman he had dedicated his life to, had been with another man. The wave of disbelief hit him first, then the anger, the familiar rush of rage that he had tried so hard to suppress. He felt his pulse quicken, his hands shaking as the paper seemed to burn in his grasp. All of the doubts that had lingered for so long now had a concrete form. This was no longer just a suspicion. It was real. His wife had been cheating on him with Terry, the very man he had never once suspected. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Mary entered the room, her eyes briefly meeting his before she quickly looked away. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the silence that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Matthew stood up slowly, the paper still clenched tightly in his fist. "Matthew?" Mary's voice was soft, hesitant, as she took a few cautious steps toward him. Without a word, he held the receipt up to her face. The room seemed to shrink as his eyes bore into hers, searching for any sign of remorse, any explanation that could make this right. She froze. The color drained from her face, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the weight of what was happening. Mary's eyes flicked nervously to the receipt and then back to him. Her lips parted, but no words came. "Explain this." Matthew's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. His heart ached, but the fury in him blotted it out. "How long has this been going on, Mary?" Mary stood still, her mind racing. There were no excuses, no way to make it sound better. The guilt gnawed at her, but in that moment she couldn't bring herself to apologize. She was caught. There was no running from it now. I didn't mean for it to happen, Matthew," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know who else to turn to." Matthew's fists clenched at his sides. "Who else to turn to? For what, Mary? For love? For affection?" His voice broke and the pain seeped through his words. "You've been seeing him, haven't you? Behind my back after everything I've done for you and this family?" Mary looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The silence between them was deafening, filled with so much hurt that it seemed to echo through the room. "I never wanted to hurt you," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "But I was so lonely, Matthew. You were never here. You didn't see me, not really." She finally looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I felt invisible." The words hit Matthew like a punch to the gut. His heart, which had already been shattered by the betrayal, sank even lower. But in that moment, something else flared inside him. His love for her, his commitment to their family, was suffocating in the weight of the hurt and betrayal. "I've been here," he said, his voice low and strained. "I've been here every single day, building a life for us, for you. And this is how you repay me?" Mary's hands trembled at her sides, and she took a step closer, reaching out to him. But Matthew stepped back, holding up his hand to stop her. "No, don't," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "I can't do this anymore. I thought we had something real, Mary, but now I'm just another fool." The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Matthew turned and walked to the door, not looking back. As Mary stood there, staring at the receipt in his hand, she knew the moment had passed. The life they had built together, everything they had once shared, was over. The weight of what she had done was more than she could bear, but it was too late now. The moment Matthew walked out of the room, the silence felt unbearable. He slammed the door behind him, leaving Mary frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to make sense of what had just transpired. She had confessed, but there was no relief. The words she had said hung heavy in the air between them, each one sealing her fate. But even as the door clicked shut, she knew this wasn't over. The storm that had been brewing was only just beginning. Matthew's anger was palpable, and she knew it would come crashing down on her. The weight of his disappointment and betrayal crushed her, but the guilt she carried in her chest was unbearable. She felt trapped in a corner of her own making. Minutes passed. The air felt thick, oppressive. Mary paced in the small living room, her mind racing. Her thoughts tangled into a mess of shame and regret. She had never intended for things to go this far. She never imagined the consequences would be so severe. Then the door opened again. Matthew stood in the doorway, his face pale with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked at her, eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and pure rage. "How long, Mary?" His voice was low, but it cut through the air like a knife. "How long has this been going on?" Mary could barely breathe as she looked into his eyes. The pain there, hurt, anger, betrayal, was suffocating. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt useless. She wanted to apologize, to beg for his forgiveness, but she knew it was too late for that. There was nothing she could say that would undo the damage. "Answer me!" Matthew shouted, his voice rising. The tension in the room thickened, the atmosphere crackling with raw emotion. Mary's eyes welled with tears as she took a step back, her body trembling. I'm sorry, Matthew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to go this far." "You never meant for it to go this far?" Matthew's voice broke with disbelief. "What, you thought this was just a little mistake? A passing thing? His voice cracked. "You've been seeing him behind my back, behind our children's backs, and you thought it was just a little mistake?" Mary's heart shattered at the words. She could barely hold back her tears as she met his gaze. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with everything, was now looking at her like she was a stranger. I was lonely," Mary said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know what to do. You stopped seeing me. You stopped hearing me. I felt like I was invisible, Matthew." Matthew's eyes widened, and for a moment there was a flicker of something. Regret, perhaps? But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the coldness that had begun to take over his every word. "You think I stopped seeing you?" His voice was sharp, edged with disbelief. "I've been here, Mary. I've been here every single day, giving everything I have to this church, to our family. And this is how you repay me? You go behind my back and betray me with him?" The finality in his words hit her like a blow to the chest. The truth was unbearable. There was no turning back now. The walls of their marriage had crumbled, and no amount of apology could rebuild them. "Matthew, please." Mary stepped forward, reaching out to him, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you, I swear I didn't. I love you, but I needed more. I needed someone to care, someone who saw me for who I am, not just as your wife, not just as the perfect preacher's wife." Matthew took a step back, his eyes now dark with fury. "No. Don't you dare try to turn this around on me, Mary. Don't you dare try to make me the villain in this story. You made your choice. You chose him. You chose to betray everything we built together." The silence in the room was suffocating. Mary stood there, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen Matthew like this. The man she had once loved, the man who had stood beside her through so much, now seemed like a stranger. "I don't know who you are anymore," Matthew muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I'm looking at right now." Mary's chest tightened with the weight of his words. She had hoped in some twisted way that by admitting the truth, they could somehow fix this, find a way back to what they once had. But as the anger swelled in his eyes, she realized that hope was gone. And then, everything changed in a moment. Without warning, Matthew moved toward the small cabinet where they kept the gun for protection. His hand shook as he reached for it, the rage in his eyes now consuming him. Mary's heart stopped as she realized what was happening. "Matthew, no," she whispered, her voice a strangled cry. But it was too late. The gunshot rang out, deafening and final. The silence in the house was deafening. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that screamed of what had just occurred, of lives being torn apart. Matthew stood motionless, his heart racing, his hands still trembling after the chaos that had unfolded in mere seconds. The gunshot echoed in his ears, reverberating in his chest, leaving a hollow emptiness where his thoughts used to be. He didn't know what he had just done, or what it meant, but he knew it was irreversible. Mary lay motionless on the floor, her life slowly slipping away, her breath shallow and weak. She had reached for him, but he had turned away, her attempt to apologize too little, too late. The reality of the moment was suffocating, but Matthew couldn't tear his gaze away from her. He had never imagined this outcome, never considered that things would escalate to such a catastrophic end. The children. The thought hit him like a thunderclap. What would they think? How would they ever understand what had happened? They had always seen their parents as a team, as a unit, a family. But that illusion was shattered now, just like their mother. Matthew could already hear the questions echoing in his mind, the voices of his daughters asking him why. Why had this happened? Why had he done it? The silence was broken by the sound of the front door opening. The familiar voice of one of the neighbors calling out was distant, muffled by the haze of confusion that clung to his thoughts. The weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy cloak. He couldn't move. He didn't know what to do next. Everything he had once known, everything he had worked for seemed to crumble beneath his feet. "Matthew?" The voice came again, more urgent this time. The neighbor was closer now, but Matthew couldn't move. He stood frozen, trapped in the moment, the horrifying realization of what he had done slowly sinking in. His heart pounded in his chest as the door creaked open wider and footsteps approached. He barely registered the presence of the neighbor, who stopped short upon seeing Mary on the floor. "Oh my God!" the neighbor gasped, rushing to her side. Matthew's mind was clouded with panic. He should have stopped it. He should have been the one to save her. But he didn't. His fingers still clenched tightly around the handle of the gun, and the cold steel felt foreign in his hand. "Matthew, what the hell happened?" The neighbor's voice was frantic, his hand reaching for his phone to call for help. Matthew couldn't speak. His voice was stuck, lodged in his throat like a lump of stone. How could he explain this? How could he explain that in a moment of overwhelming emotion, he had killed the woman he had loved for so many years? How could he tell anyone that the rage he had been carrying inside had erupted in a split second, leaving destruction in its wake? As the neighbor stepped back, dialing the emergency number, Matthew slowly lowered the gun, his body numb. He felt disconnected from himself, as though he was watching this nightmare unfold from outside his own body. He couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to apologize or to take responsibility. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like an immovable force, suffocating him with guilt. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. The flashing lights outside the window illuminated the room, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The sound of sirens grew louder, and suddenly the house that had once felt like home now felt like a prison. Matthew's heart raced as he was taken into custody. The officers didn't speak to him at first, they just placed him in handcuffs, their eyes filled with the grim knowledge of what had just transpired. The truth was now inescapable. The family he had once known was gone. Mary, the woman he had spent his life with, was dead, and he was the one responsible. His daughters would never understand what happened, never be able to look at him the same way again. He had shattered their world, destroyed everything he had worked so hard to build. As he was led to the police car, Matthew's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. How did it come to this? How had the man he had once been, a devoted preacher, a loving husband, become someone capable of such violence? He wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but it was too late. The damage had been done. And as the car pulled away from the house, leaving the life he had known behind, Matthew was left alone with the crushing weight of his own guilt, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. The courthouse was packed with onlookers, reporters, and community members, all eager to witness the trial of Matthew Winkler, the respected preacher who had now become infamous for a crime that shattered his family. The tragedy of Mary's death had left the town divided. Some believed Matthew was a victim of emotional turmoil, while others saw him as a cold-blooded murderer. But in that courtroom, the truth of what had happened was now up for debate. Mary's defense team wasted no time painting a picture of the emotional abuse she had allegedly endured in her marriage. They portrayed Matthew as a controlling husband who, over the years, had drained Mary of her confidence and self-worth. According to their argument, the affair was not merely a betrayal. It was a desperate attempt to feel seen and loved, something she hadn't experienced in years. Mary was isolated, emotionally abandoned by her husband, the defense attorney stated, his voice firm and compassionate. She had no escape, no one to turn to but Terry. And when Matthew found out, he reacted violently, not out of reason but out of years of bottled-up frustration and neglect. Mary sat quietly in the courtroom, her eyes cast downward, her face a mask of exhaustion. The words stung, but part of her knew they were true. She had felt alone for so long, and the affair, though a betrayal in its own right, had been an escape, a way to regain her sense of self-worth. On the opposite side, the prosecution painted a starkly different picture. They argued that Matthew's actions were driven by pure rage, that his anger had spiraled out of control when confronted with his wife's infidelity. They described the confrontation as an outburst, not one born of emotion but of premeditated violence. He shot his wife in cold blood, the prosecutor argued, his voice rising in the hushed courtroom. He could have walked away. He could have confronted her in a calm, rational manner, but instead he chose to kill her. His rage clouded his judgment, and he ended her life without a second thought. The prosecutor's words struck hard, and for a moment, Matthew's heart seemed to stop beating in his chest. The words cold-blooded echoed in his mind, and he fought to swallow the bile rising in his throat. Was that how he had really looked? Was that how people would remember him? A man who killed his wife in a fit of uncontrollable rage? As the trial continued, the emotional toll on Matthew became apparent. He rarely spoke, his eyes often downcast, his hands folded tightly in front of him. The truth of the crime, of what he had done, was slowly sinking in. He couldn't escape the fact that, in that moment of fury, he had destroyed everything. He had killed the woman he loved, and no amount of remorse could undo the damage. The defense team called witnesses who spoke of Mary's emotional state, friends, colleagues, even a therapist who had seen Mary privately. Their testimonies painted a picture of a woman who had been deeply unhappy in her marriage for years, who had endured constant emotional neglect, and who had turned to Terry for comfort when she felt invisible. It was clear that Mary had been suffering, but did that excuse what had happened? Did it justify murder? The prosecutor countered by calling friends and family of Matthew. They spoke of his devotion to the church, of his tireless efforts to build a strong, loving family. To them, Matthew was a man who had been wronged. He had worked hard to provide for his family, to keep them safe, and to give them everything they needed. He was not a violent man, but his sense of betrayal had brought him to a breaking point. The prosecution's final argument was the most damning. A man who truly loved his wife would never have killed her. No matter the pain, no matter the betrayal, love does not end in violence. Matthew felt the weight of those words like a punch to the gut. His defense attorneys had argued that the killing was an act of passion, the result of emotional turmoil. But the jury would decide if that was enough to excuse the crime. In his heart, Matthew knew the truth. He had lost control, and in that moment, he had let rage blind him to everything he held dear. As the trial neared its end, the jury was left to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the weight of the decision hanging over everyone present. As the judge called for a recess, Matthew sat in silence, his eyes unfocused as the words of the defense and prosecution continued to echo in his mind. There was no way to undo the past, no way to make things right again. He had destroyed his family. He had destroyed everything he had worked for. And now, he was left to face the consequences. The courtroom buzzed with an uncomfortable tension. The jury had deliberated for hours, and now everyone in the room held their breath as the foreman stood to announce the verdict. Mary's family sat in the front row, faces drawn in exhaustion, while Matthew's family members anxiously awaited the outcome. It was as if time itself had paused, leaving only the weight of the decision that was about to be made. Matthew, his hands folded tightly in his lap, stared at the floor, his heart racing. He had spent every day since the shooting drowning in guilt, replaying the tragic night over and over in his mind. He had already lost everything, his wife, his family, his standing in the community. But this verdict would define the rest of his life. There would be no escaping it. The foreman cleared his throat and the room fell silent. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Matthew Winkler, guilty of voluntary manslaughter." The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. He looked up, his gaze flicking from the jury to his wife's family, and then to his own. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only a quiet murmur of approval from some of the onlookers, while others seemed to shake their heads in disbelief. The decision was not as clear-cut as the public had expected. The room held its collective breath as the judge read the sentence. "You are hereby sentenced to 210 days in prison." Matthew blinked, unable to comprehend the enormity of what had just happened. His lawyer had fought for a lesser sentence, arguing that Mary's emotional distress and years of neglect played a role in the tragic incident. The defense had painted a picture of a man driven to the brink by years of isolation and emotional abuse. It had been a case of a man pushed beyond his breaking point, but even with the defense's plea for leniency, the verdict divided the courtroom. Mary's family, though they had been devastated by the loss, felt the verdict was too lenient. They couldn't understand how a life could be taken and the sentence so light. How could a man who had killed his wife receive such a short sentence? No amount of emotional distress could justify her death, they thought. On the other hand, some of Matthew's supporters whispered among themselves, relieved that he had not been convicted of first-degree murder. They believed he had acted out of passion, not premeditation, but even they knew the truth, that a life had been taken and there was no going back from that. As the gavel slammed down, marking the conclusion of the trial, Matthew's head sank into his hands. The weight of the verdict, of everything that had led to this point, threatened to crush him. He had lost Mary, there was no denying that. But now, as he faced a prison sentence, he realized that he had lost himself as well. In the aftermath of the verdict, the media swarmed the courthouse, eager to capture the reactions of both families. The headlines would read about the divided verdict, about the controversy that would follow. Some would call it justice, while others would argue that it was an insult to Mary's memory. Matthew's lawyer, who had fought for the reduced sentence, quietly whispered in his ear, urging him to hold his head up. But Matthew couldn't bring himself to do it. He had been given a second chance, a rare gift for someone who had taken a life. But what good was it? What was he supposed to do with a life so shattered, so irrevocably damaged? As he was escorted out of the courtroom, Matthew felt the eyes of the world on him. The judgment was final, but the questions would continue long after. Had the verdict been fair? Was 210 days enough? The answers to those questions would never bring Mary back, nor would they heal the wounds of a broken family. The courtroom doors closed behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. In the midst of the public outcry, the division between the families, and the haunting weight of his actions, Matthew walked into an uncertain future, knowing that no verdict could ever truly erase the consequences of his choices. The courtroom was still. The air hung thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to pass down the sentence. Mary's family, sitting quietly in the front row, exchanged glances, their faces pale from the exhaustion of weeks of legal proceedings. For them, the trial had been a painful reminder of their loss. The woman they had loved, the mother of their nieces and nephews, had been brutally taken from them, and now they waited for a sentence that they hoped would bring some measure of justice. Matthew sat motionless beside his attorney, his eyes red from the sleepless nights spent in his cell, replaying the events over and over in his mind. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He could still hear the sound of the gunshot echoing in his ears, feel the weight of Mary's lifeless body in his arms. The pain of the decision he had made was something he couldn't escape, but now there was no going back. As the judge opened the document in front of him, a heavy silence settled across the room. He looked up, his gaze fixed on Matthew. "Matthew Winkler," the judge began, his voice stern, "you have been convicted of voluntary manslaughter in the death of your wife, Mary Winkler. The court recognizes that you acted in a moment of passion, but that does not excuse the loss of life." Matthew's stomach turned as the judge continued, the words feeling like a punishment unto themselves. He had expected this. He knew that his actions could never be justified, that nothing could bring Mary back. But the weight of the words felt like a final sentence on his soul. "The court sentences you to 210 days in prison," the judge said, his voice unwavering. The room was silent for a beat longer, the air thick with disbelief. Mary's family looked at each other, their eyes filled with confusion and anger. 210 days? It felt like a slap in the face. How could a man who had taken the life of someone so precious be sentenced to such a brief term? To them, it wasn't enough. They wanted justice, not a slap on the wrist. Matthew's lawyer, who had worked tirelessly for a reduced sentence, seemed relieved. But Matthew felt numb. He had expected more, perhaps a longer term, something that would give him the time to atone for his sins. But 210 days? Was that all the life of Mary was worth? The truth was, nothing would ever be enough to make up for what he had done. As the judge's gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the hearing, the tension in the room shattered like glass. Mary's family stood in quiet outrage, their voices hushed but furious. The media, who had been present throughout the trial, scrambled to get their comments. Some viewed the sentence as fair, others as a travesty of justice. For Matthew, the sentence was not a relief. It was a reminder of the irreversible choices he had made. The walls of his world had crumbled, and now all he could do was face the consequences. He would spend 210 days in prison, yes, but the real punishment, the real burden, was the guilt he would carry for the rest of his life. As the courtroom cleared, reporters swarmed the family, asking for their thoughts. Mary's sister, tears streaking down her face, said in a trembling voice, "This is not justice. This is not enough. Mary's life meant more than this. She deserved more than this." The media captured the raw emotion of the moment as voices clashed in disagreement. Some people felt that Matthew's sentence was too lenient, while others believed he had been wronged by his own mental state. Yet the true pain of the situation was felt by those who loved Mary most. For them, no amount of time in prison could ever make up for the loss they had suffered. The world was divided. Some thought Matthew had paid his price, while others felt he had gotten away too easily. But none of it mattered to Mary's family, who were left to grapple with the reality that the woman they loved would never return. Matthew was escorted out of the courtroom by police officers, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched in defeat. As he was led to the holding area, the weight of his actions pressed on him. He couldn't escape the truth. His life, as he had known it, was gone. His reputation, his family, his faith, all of it had been ripped away in an instant. The sentence may have been delivered, but the real consequences of his actions were far from over. After the sentencing, Mary left Tennessee for a new life. The weight of the past clung to her every step, but she couldn't stay in a town that was now tainted with the memory of her marriage and the tragedy that had unfolded. The town's whispers had become deafening, and every corner felt like a reminder of the life she had lost. Her children were now living with relatives, their lives altered forever. The promise of reunification, of healing, felt like a distant dream. But Mary had no choice but to move forward, even if that meant leaving everything behind, her home, her community, the very essence of who she had been. She found a small apartment in a quiet city, far away from the prying eyes of Selmer. The anonymity of it was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it gave her the freedom to rebuild, to create a new identity. But on the other, it left her isolated, cut off from the people she had once known. There was no one to call, no one to help her pick up the pieces. She was truly alone now. Mary spent her days trying to adjust to a life without Matthew, without the routine she had known for so many years. She tried to reach out to her children, but they were struggling to understand what had happened. They were angry and confused, too young to grasp the complexities of their mother's decisions. The letters she sent were returned unopened. Each letter felt like a reminder of the chasm that now separated them. In the evenings, she would sit in her new apartment, the soft hum of the city outside the window, and wonder if she had made the right choice. Was this truly a fresh start, or was she simply running away from the consequences of her actions? The guilt that she carried was never far from the surface. She had taken a life, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she could never escape that fact. But there were moments, fleeting moments, when she allowed herself to breathe. When she allowed herself to imagine a life where the weight of her past didn't define her every decision. The small victories, like finding a job at a local bookstore, gave her something to hold on to. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something for herself. Not for Matthew, not for her children, but for her. One evening, she found herself in the quiet of her apartment, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. Her eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now seemed clearer, though there was a faint sadness behind them. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something she hadn't had in years: freedom. The freedom to choose, to make decisions that were hers and hers alone. But with that freedom came the burden of knowing that she could never undo the damage she had caused. Mary knew that no matter how hard she tried to rebuild, no matter how much time passed, the loss of Matthew and the destruction of her family would always be a part of her. She had killed the man she once loved, and she would never escape that fact. Yet, in the midst of all this, there was a glimmer of hope, a small, fragile hope that perhaps with time she could find a way to reconcile her past with her future. Perhaps one day she could find a way to be the mother her children needed, the woman she once aspired to be. For now, though, she would have to settle for the present, one day at a time. As she lay down to sleep that night, Mary closed her eyes and tried not to think about what was lost. Instead, she focused on what lay ahead. A new life, a new beginning. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers to shape. Mary sat in the dimly lit room of her small apartment, the soft hum of the city outside only amplifying the silence that enveloped her. The past few months had been a blur of trying to rebuild a life, but the ghosts of what had happened still clung to her, lingering in the corners of her mind. Each new day felt like a fragile thread, barely holding together the fabric of a life she had never truly wanted to unravel, but had done so, piece by piece, with her choices. Her reflection in the mirror seemed foreign, like a woman who had stepped out of time. The vibrant, hopeful woman she had been before everything had fallen apart was now replaced with someone weathered, worn by the burdens of the past. She had hoped that with time the weight of her actions would ease, but it never did. The memories were sharp, cutting into her with relentless clarity. Her children had finally agreed to speak with her after months of silence. The calls were brief, guarded. They were angry at her for what she had done, angry at the world for taking their father away, for tearing their family apart. They didn't understand, and how could they? How could she explain to them that the love they saw in her eyes had turned to desperation, that the decisions she had made were born from a place of loneliness so deep it consumed her? "I'm sorry, but I can't take it back," Mary whispered to herself, her voice barely a breath. The words were meaningless, and yet they were all she had left to offer. Her children could never understand that she had never wanted this for them, never wanted to bring them into the storm of her decisions. But the truth was now unavoidable. The damage was done. As she stood from the small table, her fingers brushed against the faded photograph of Matthew, of the family they had once been. The photograph was cracked, the edges worn from years of being touched, held, and finally discarded. A part of her still loved him. A part of her still mourned the man she had lost, even though that man had been long gone before the trigger had been pulled. The decision that had torn her life apart was now irreversible. No amount of time could erase the choices she had made in a moment of weakness. As much as she wished it could, she could never undo the violence, the anger, the betrayal. She couldn't bring Matthew back. She couldn't restore the family she had destroyed. But there was one thing left, one thing that might give her some semblance of peace. Mary picked up the phone, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed a number she had avoided for months. It rang several times before the voice on the other end answered. "Hello? Hi, it's me." Her voice faltered for just a moment, but she steadied herself. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I'm here. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." There was silence for a long moment, a moment that stretched out like a river that seemed impossible to cross. Then the voice on the other end spoke again, quieter this time. "We've been through so much, but I hear you. I hear you." The conversation didn't last long, but it was enough. Enough for Mary to feel something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, or at least the beginning of it. She wasn't sure what it would look like, this new life she was trying to build, but she knew she couldn't keep running from the past. The truth of her actions and the weight of the consequences would always be with her. But she could choose to move forward. She could choose to rebuild piece by piece, even if it was only a shadow of the life she once dreamed of. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and hard truths, but it was hers to walk, and perhaps in the end, that was all she could ask for, a chance to find redemption, however small. As Mary sat back down on the worn sofa, she felt something shift within her, a quiet acceptance. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose to live with it. She could find a way to honor the memory of the family she had destroyed by trying to make something better, something new. For the first time in a long time, Mary allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could heal. What do you think of Mary Winkler's actions and the verdict in her case? Do you believe justice was served? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories.